I'm David Dollar, Senior Fellow in the John L. Thornton China Center here at Brookings. This is the economics panel. I would say the narrow topic is President Obama's trip to China and APEC summit and G20 summit and some of the economic issues that are going to come up. But the broader topic is really China's economic reform and U.S.-China economic relations. And we're very fortunate to have an outstanding group of non-resident fellows from our China Center here. So all three of our panelists are non-resident fellows. I don't know if this was by design, but it showcased very nicely how we use the non-resident fellow position. You've got the full bio, so I'll just say briefly, Charles Freeman, international principal at Forbes Tate here at the firm here in Washington, and long time involvement in U.S.-China relations. Malcolm Lee has worked all over the U.S. government. I couldn't even name all the different agencies, but also head of Microsoft strategy for China, so has the business perspective. Wing Tai Wu, old friend of mine, a macroeconomist, professor at UC Davis, also teaches at a range of universities in China and around East Asia. So we're going to go in alphabetical order, starting with Charles, and really ask him each to stick to 7 minutes initially, so we'll have time for a conversation and time for Q&A. So, Charles.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here, and it's fun to be a non-resident fellow with such distinguished fellow panelists, as well as those of you in the audience. Like a lot of political junkies, I was up most of the night. To what end, I'm not sure. But if I'm incoherent, I'll blame it on that. I want to talk a little bit about the U.S.-China economic relationship in the context of both the regional and bilateral economic relations. And I think this is a conversation really about the clash of good policy and politics, whether it's good or bad. And I think if you look at the U.S. policy with respect to the region on trade and economics and with China, you've got, as I think Mr. Donnellan articulated very, very well, some very sound reasons for what we're trying to do, both in the TPP and with the bilateral investment treaty. With the TPP, clearly on a strategic macro level, you've got a focus on trying to maintain U.S. relevance, if not primacy, in the rule-making organizations that are going to set the stage for global trade rules for the decades to come. And you've got a real emphasis, particularly in the TPP, with trying to set the rules on areas that have not been traditionally covered by trade agreements, particularly in looking at the flow of data and information across borders, of looking at the importance of intellectual property as a function of trade, looking at the realities of a very dynamic and complex supply chain and the movement of intermediate goods across borders, as well as dealing with some traditional areas like agriculture, which are always difficult. That's a very good agenda. On the China, and with respect to the bilateral investment treaty, you're looking at an effort really to try to deal with some of the things that were left out of the WTO accession 10, 12 years ago that continue to raise challenges for U.S. businesses, as well as set the stage for what I think is kind of the new move to increase Chinese investment in the United States in ways that is foreseeable and transparent and useful for both countries. On the Chinese side, I think you're looking at the bilateral investment treaty, as I think Mr. Donnellan said, as a means to try to use an external pressure to drive internal reform. Very good, very useful, and you look at things like the creation of the Shanghai Free Trade Zone as a kind of tool to try out some of the concepts that are appearing in the BIT discussions. You've got a strong interest in the TPP as a potential means of driving Chinese reform. Both good policies in Beijing and Washington. The politics will intervene. I know that many people who are trade enthusiasts, trade policy enthusiasts, were cheered by some of the events last night with the arrival of a strong Republican majority in both houses. The challenge here is that trade votes, regardless who you are tough. They're painful. And I don't think just because the Republicans are there that without the president pushing a lot of Democrats to move towards voting for TPP, that you'll see it happen. And given the kind of the distance that we've seen Senate and House Democrats take from the president, that's going to be easier said than done. And particularly when you can look at trade votes as being a vote for the haves versus the have-nots, and where the kind of the mood of the country is on inequality, I think it will be much more difficult to push for a passage of either TPP or, frankly, the BIT than otherwise. In China, the politics are you've got rapid centralization and consolidation of power under Xi Jinping. He's taken on a huge political agenda. Does he really have time to focus in this climate where he's dealing with a huge anti-corruption campaign and getting the House in order? Does he really have time to get at the nitty-gritty of reform in the short term in ways that would allow, the BIT to proceed, an ambitious negative list in the BIT to be brought forward? I'm not sure, and I'm frankly quite skeptical. So I'm not sure that you have the politics in place in either Washington or Beijing that would allow some of the good policies to be implemented or pushed forward in the next few years. And that's against the background of, I think, a somewhat deteriorating U.S.-China business relationship. You've got a perception, at least, in Washington and in the United States that foreign firms, and U.S. firms in particular, are being singled out in a discriminatory way on areas like the anti-monopoly law or in food safety or pharmaceuticals. And you're seeing kind of the beginning of enforcement by Chinese agencies without kind of the software to run that kind of a complex device. So I think you're seeing that. And then, as Mr. Donnellan articulated, the issue of cyber is enormous and looming and presents a huge challenge to the two countries in terms of forwarding the bilateral relationship, even absent the political situation in both Washington and Beijing.
Okay, thanks, Charles. That was great, very self-disciplined, and I'm going to push you when we get the conversation, push you a little bit further on the politics, both in China and in the United States on the BIT. Okay, Malcolm?
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, David. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on some of the strategic themes that Tom Donnellan hit on the economic side. He really did cover it all, and I'll start with the proposition and concern expressed by some Chinese colleagues that the rebalance to Asia is really focused on isolating China. I think that couldn't be more from the truth. China's the world's second largest economy. It accounts for 29% of global growth. And so this president and this administration understands that strengthening our economic relations with China needs to be at the centerpiece of the Asia rebalance. And at the center of that rebalance with China is China's own rebalancing of its own economy to a more sustainable model of growth that contributes to global demand. It's a goal both President Obama and President Xi both share. The general direction in China has been set, through the third plenum. But the key is whether China will make the reforms quickly enough and with a broad enough scope to prevent a hard landing of the Chinese economy, and also to avoid a hard landing in China's economic relations with its major trading partners. Economists forecast China's growth in 2020 at various levels. But I'm not an economist, but as I look at their predictions, the variations depend to a large degree on success, pace, and scope of the economic and rule of law reforms that China has set forth. Taking China's economy to the next stage of development by increasing consumption, that means household consumption, not necessarily purchase of more raw materials from around the world, openness, market forces, competition, innovation, respect for intellectual property, and rule of law are all part of China's plans, as outlined, as I mentioned, the third and fourth plenums. But movement has been slow from a U.S. perspective, and it's very clear that the party will retain a very significant, if not dominant, role in rule of law, and that industrial policy remains very firmly infused in significant portions of China's economy and regulation. Let me talk a little bit about free trade agreements. The topic of this session is partially free trade and the Asia Pacific. The two major regional trade agreements in which the United States engaged, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and our negotiations with Europe, arose in significant part out of the need for higher disciplined trade agreements that can address the really tough regulatory barriers behind the border that can effectively deny market access. Trade liberalization needs to continue to move forward. And these negotiations arose because the multilateral liberalization and trade process has stalled. And because some countries have not shown a lot of willingness to address these behind-the-border measures in their own market. These are extremely difficult issues, as Charles mentioned. These go to how countries organize themselves, to their values. They're very difficult, but it's the next stage of liberalization. And these are, in many ways, defining what free trade means in the 21st century. You know, as the White House indicated earlier this week, the U.S. does support a longer-term goal of an Asia-Pacific free trade area, but built on regional, the strength of strong, high-discipline regional arrangements. So, you know, how can China respond to this? China will make its own decisions, but I think there's some, you know, positive movement already. I mean, as Tom indicated, you know, the bilateral investment treaty is an enormous opportunity for both countries. It's going to be a rules-based anchor that will take that discipline and the high level of openness to the next level. So strategically and economically, it's vitally important. I would also say that, as Tom mentioned, you know, China and the United States, there are no two countries that have benefited more from an open multilateral trading system. The multilateral trading, many people are questioning the viability, the utility of the multilateral trading system. I think China and the U.S. need to join to show leadership to make the WTO round and negotiations productive and useful, and show it can produce some results. You know, there have been some positive cooperation. China and the U.S. supported a trade facilitation agreement. It's been held up by some other countries. But I think as the president heads off to Asia and China leads in the APEC meeting, there's a great opportunity for China to show its leadership in supporting the liberalization and expansion of the Information Technology Agreement, which zeroes out tariffs on a wide range of technology products and is well overdue for updating. APEC has been in the past, in fact, the original ITA in, I think, '96, APEC was a catalyst for the WTO, the WTO's initial ITA agreement, and China can play that role again. I also think that China, there's some other multilateral rules that China has yet to join, but I think the time has come. China committed in its accession to the WTO to join the government procurement agreement, which increases transparency in government procurement, fair bidding, and non-discrimination at a certain level of purchases. It would be timely, I think, for China to step forward and join that agreement. So moving beyond the multilateral, you know, what can we do bilaterally? I think the most important thing we do bilateral, certainly a negotiation of a bid is important, but we need to ensure on the economic side that the strategic and economic dialogue and the JCCT are functioning well, that commitments are fully implemented, that we are shown to be making it work. It's where we bring, each country brings our toughest issues While some may view the progress as incremental, with similar issues appearing year after year, the principles that underlie, if you read the principles of these declarations, they are meaningful and can move the ball very forward. I'll just mention two areas that are extremely important. One is intellectual property. Intellectual property is essential to China's own movement to the next stage of development for innovation. Intellectual property is where many of China's trading partners have their own comparative advantage. And so it's essential that for China's own development and for the global trading system to work, that intellectual property be respected, that it be protected, that it be treated without regard to the nationality of ownership of the intellectual property. Secondly is regulation. It's very important that regulation be divorced from industrial policy. Charles mentioned the business climate of foreign companies feeling somewhat targeted, that their confidence is somewhat lower. In fact, I think there have been over years many challenges faced by multinational companies in China. But interestingly, in the last year, we've seen an actual decrease in China's foreign investment. As of August, it was 7.2 billion, down 14% from the year before, which was the biggest decline in 4 years. There are other reasons that may contribute to that, of slowing growth of China, but it certainly is something to take note of. And AmCham China released a survey that found that 60% of companies in China feel that China is a less welcoming place to do business, up from 41% in 2013. Just one area that Charles also mentioned was the enforcement of the anti-monopoly law. It combines issues of industrial policy, market access, transparency, due process, rule of law. And why does it matter? China does need an anti-monopoly law. It should be enforcing its anti-monopoly law. But as Charles mentioned, the software is very important as these investigations proceed, as China reviews global mergers with potentially global impact with respect to remedies on merger reviews, remedies on investigations. To the extent a remedy is imposed, it not only has impact, can not only have impact in China for goods sold to Chinese consumers. To the extent a good is produced in China, and most IT products are produced in China and shipped abroad, a limitation of the royalty of a patent, or a limitation of a royalty of a patent into a standard can have global implications. And IP is an area that has been identified by both U.S. and foreign businesses and the U.S. government as an area that there's a feeling that there's a targeting of intellectual property. One issue is response has been, well, there is no discrimination. There's not discrimination for foreign companies. China's enforcing against its own companies as well. Well, I think the response is that issues of due process, issues of transparency, should apply not only to foreign companies, but to domestic companies as well. So this is an area that is not subject to clear WTO rules, and China has an enormous power because of the size of its market in regulating its market, and because of its role as a major world manufacturer.
Okay, thanks. Malcolm raised some important issues about China's domestic reform and how they interact with its different negotiations and with U.S.-China relations. So good issues to follow up on. Wing?
Well, Li Cheng, thank you very much for including me in today's event. The two issues for this panel are the Chinese economy and free trade. For each of these components, I will focus my comments on a trade-off in each of them that's holding back progress. For the Chinese economy, the trade-off that's holding back progress is a trade-off between the state's desire to maintain control over social, economic, and political life versus allowing the private sector to become an even bigger driver of growth and in determination of social software. And in the free trade area, the trade-off is really that of the US. Between the US desire to push for common prosperity through a global framework against the concern about the strategic implications of the rise of China in East Asia. I think the two trade-offs are what that's holding back progress. On the economy, since the Xi government came to power, it has been busy correcting the overdose of macroeconomic stimulus that was introduced to fight the global financial crisis. The macroeconomic overdose took the form of infrastructure spending, which caused the property bubble, which then allowed, or rather drove the local governments to undertake unusual financing, which now threaten the domestic financial system, and the local governments also engage in more land grab, which exacerbated social tension. And the whole infrastructure bust naturally allowed an amount of corruption that was unprecedented. So what is happening now is that the economy has slowed since 2012 compared with the previous years, a lot having to do with trying to correct the excesses that were created. And this is good politics. After all, if you have to have a corrective recession, you should do it at the beginning of your term rather than at the end of it. So, but what are the instruments that are available to reflect? So what has been happening in the last 2 quarters is that international trade has been very important in holding up economic growth in the last 2 quarters. But the fact that the Japanese on October 30th is undertaking an enlargement of its quantitative easing program shows that aggregate demand in Japan is not doing well. And today's Financial Times reported that Brussels has now cut German growth rate from 2% to 1.1% in 2015, and French growth rate from 1.5% to 0.7% growth in 2015. Basically, a half of what the growth in the Eurozone is going to be. So what has been buoying up the Chinese economy in the last 2 quarters has been removed. So clearly, domestic demand has to play a bigger role. The easiest way to generate demand are the ways that the government has no wish to do. One of them is certainly to let the construction sector rip again, have another real estate bubble. After all, what is our quantitative easing? Buying mortgage-backed securities, the very instruments that caused the 2008 collapse. So the Chinese certainly do not want to have another housing bubble, and they do not want to have an infrastructure program that results in expensive and dodgy public works that spawn corruption. So the real choice is to allow the private sector to expand investment and consumption. The investment side would mean that removing the investment financing constraint that all private Chinese enterprises suffer from. They are simply unable to get adequate working capital loans from the banks largely because this is a monopoly state banking system. China needs to have private banking, especially small and medium private banks. And together with that, to have the growth of the private sector, you have to allow the development of a housing sector that is sustainable. Most of the housing that's built in urban China, bigger cities, are for the middle class and upper middle class. But the people moving in are the peasants. So that's a mismatch. The way the mortgage system works is, the way to get a mortgage, you got to put down a collateral. To have collateral means that you already have an apartment. So you use the existing apartment to buy, and to use the collateral to buy another apartment. So you need private housing cooperatives to occur. And I think China needs to have a public housing program that works. But housing program should only be a small part of that stimulus, because it is hard thing to manage, to be free from corruption, and to be efficient, and to be built in the places where the poor are willing to live. The setting up of private businesses through the financial sector deregulation is important. But in order to allow the financial deregulation to lead to the setting up of small, medium private banks that work, you need to have, I think, the privatization of rural land, so that the rural people could move wholeheartedly out from the countryside, do not feel that they should stay behind to claim the land when it is privatized. And furthermore, this allows them the capital to start business by giving property rights to the land. And together with that would not be inefficient, would not be effective, unless you couple that with a great relaxation of the household registration system. So financial sector deregulation, and promote sustainable urbanization through rural land privatization and the ending of the household hukou system. That we have a lot to talk about, the details, the difficulties, but I think that let me get to free trade. On free trade, I'd like to make comments on the global level, the regional level, and the bilateral level. In a recent interview with Tom Friedman, President Obama said that China has been a free rider on the international scene for the last 30 years. This has certainly the case when you look at WTO. In fact, China has been such a free rider in the WTO that it is against its own best interest. What is holding up the Doha round? What's holding up the Doha round is agricultural protectionism in the Western European countries and Japan and the United States. And on the developing countries side, they do not wish to relax lower tariff on manufacturing goods. So let us say that the US is able to prevail on its former Cold War allies, or rather present allies in the new Cold War, to lower agricultural protectionism. Would the developing world therefore be able to lower tariffs? It will not happen, because the leadership of the WTO bloc of the LDCs is headed by Brazil and India. And Brazil and India do not want this lower, not because they are afraid of manufactured imports from the G7, they are afraid of manufacturing imports from China. So what it means is China should take over the leadership of the developing countries in WTO and push for the completion of the Doha round. And on the regional level, we have the following strange situation. If you look at the multinational banks, the international financial organizations, World Bank and the ADB were set up to hand out money for hardware infrastructure. But over time, it has come to be replaced by the dispensation of advice instead. The 10 Commandments of the Washington Consensus, for example. So this neglect of hardware provision by the international development banks is possibly inevitable given that the Cold War is over. And so the Chinese have come forward and said, since you're not giving enough money for hardware development, we will set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And it's naturally much welcome in Southeast Asia. And for the US Treasury to be going around telling people to do what's not in their best interest, which is don't join the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, is shooting ourselves in the foot. Why are we telling these people not to pursue things in their best interest? And in the regional free trade area, the Chinese have proposed the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which will be a free trade area of the 10 ASEAN countries and the 6 countries, Japan, Korea, China, Australia, India, New Zealand. And the US has responded with TPP, and because we want a high-quality free trade area. Nice words, but who has signed up for TPP so far? It is so high quality that we cannot get new members to sign up, which is embarrassing. So what do? We are in ardent pursuit of Malaysia and compromising all way of high quality. Malaysia can keep its race-based government procurement policies, for example, to sign the TPP. So basically, so why don't we have something that is more inclusive than TPP versus RCEP? Let's have one that encompasses both sides. The free trade areas of the Asia-Pacific would be a much bigger grouping that will encompass everybody. And China actually should apply to join TPP, or rather have one of its proxies within the present TPP structure to apply to nominate China for membership. And then let's get to the bilateral level. The bilateral level, we have always been stuck with the value of the renminbi because we are concerned about Chinese trade imbalances. Because a big trade imbalance means that they're stealing our jobs. Yes, partly there's no doubt there's a transfer of jobs out to China, especially after signing of WTO. There was a natural correction of that artificial division of labor that was caused by the Cold War. So that's not our real concern. What should be our real concern is not the stealing of present jobs, but the stealing of future high-paying jobs that is done by industrial espionage. So intellectual property rights should be a much bigger issue than it has been, rather than this focus on static gains of trade balances and the value of the yuan. Okay, I see the.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so a common thread through all of this that I saw was, some thinking about important economic reforms in China. What's the progress for them? How they relate? So I'm gonna start with Charles, and you talked about the importance of the bilateral investment treaty negotiations, and the two sides. Each side is going to come with an initial negative list in the first quarter of 2015, and you alluded to the possibility that China might come with a relatively small focused list that lead to kind of a quick negotiation and would reflect some real soul searching in China about moving ahead with opening up sectors and reform, or they could come with essentially the whole investment catalog, and that would be kind of a disappointing signal. So you talked about the importance of politics. So I'd like you to speculate a little bit, maybe stick your neck out a little bit on what we're likely to see, and then if you want to get into the U.S. side, does the decisions, the results last night make it more likely we get a BIT within 2 years? Takes 67% of the Senate, or is it really pretty hopeless to get a BIT within 2 years?
I first of all, to answer to your second question, I doubt very seriously that will actually finish the negotiation of a BIT before the end of the Obama administration. So I just can't see us getting to that question until 2016 at the earliest. On the question of what the politics will be that will drive whatever negative list China puts forward, I think it's very difficult. I mean, we're already seeing, if you talk to some of the people that have been put in charge of the reforms in China, you're already seeing the shaking of the heads, and this is a lot tougher than we thought it was going to be, and gosh, the interests really are dug in, and you don't have the kind of institutional process in China where the vested interests go and they communicate to the regulators or the reformers in a kind of transparent way of what the issues are, and there's no real capacity to measure what the genuine economic impact would be at the institutional level of what, presenting a more ambitious negative list or otherwise. In that kind of circumstance, I think what you'll see is a bit of a Solomonic splitting of the baby, and you'll get something that looks half ambitious and half difficult. The challenge is, I think Tom Donilon, I think, rightly referred to the importance of mind share among policymakers. And if you're presented with a negative list, if China presents a negative list in January 2015 that looks like it's going to require an awful lot of deep digging by the administration in order to get this thing through by the end of the term, I'm not sure that if I'm Mike Froman, that's where I spend my mind share. Because there's plenty of other stuff to be worried about with TPP, with TTIP, ITA, maybe even the Trade and Services Agreement. How much time do you really want to spend knocking heads with recalcitrant Chinese negotiators who will leave blood on the floor?
Right. So then, is there a risk that the U.S.-China economic relationship languishes because this becomes a long, drawn-out, multi-year process, and the business community gets frustrated, loses interest?
I think there's a strong chance that happens, and will require real leadership both in Beijing, here, not only in the White House but on the Hill, to make that happen. In answer to your question about whether this new Congress is going to be more welcoming of a bit than otherwise, I'm not sure. If you talk to people even in fairly safe districts that are nominally very pro-free trade, don't have a lot of angst about the Chinese-U.S. economic relationship, even they would rather not vote on something like this, because there's not a whole lot of benefit to laying yourself out for something like this. And unless the business community genuinely gets excited, enthusiastic about a bit, it's going to be very difficult to push something through the Hill.
Okay. Malcolm and Wing, you each raised some very important economic reforms that are going on in China, or potentially, legal reform, intellectual property rights protection that Malcolm was talking about. Wing talked about financial liberalization, development of private banks, and then some pretty radical things, privatizing land and eliminating the hukou system. So what I really would like from each of you, starting with Malcolm, is a kind of a more political assessment of, what is the prospect for these reforms going forward. Malcolm, you, I believe, were the one who alluded to the fact that there are a lot of different forecasts for China's growth, and they really come back to an assessment about the appetite for reform and the implementation ability of the Xi administration. If you think there's going to be a lot of reform, then it's easier to be optimistic about China's growth. Conference Board came out recently with very, kind of very negative assessment. Doesn't see any reform going forward. Forecast growth of 3.9%. So, so Malcolm, can you?
So I'm going to mix metaphors here. I think intellectual property will improve at the pace where there's demand. It's demand-led. So China clearly wants to move to an innovation-led growth model away from a manufacturing low-end export model. And there's no question. The head of Microsoft Research used to say that innovation equals IQ plus IP, and there's plenty of IQ in China. Bill Gates said, when he was asked why did I open up a research facility in China with 2,000 researchers, several years ago, I figured with 1.3 billion people to be a couple smart ones. There's no question. I mean, the capabilities of China are immense. Just the raw intellectual capacity, but you need the software. You need the regime that's going to encourage innovation, and it will move as it will move as fast as already there's significant litigation, majority of it between Chinese firms on IP rights. And so, I think the leadership and the government understands that every Chinese IP law is being amended, revised, rewritten, but there's still an enormous, gap on enforcement. There's concern about it's difficult to get paid for intellectual property. Intellectual property is being stolen, and of concern to China's trading partners. There have been policies that have treated domestic intellectual property more favorably than foreign intellectual property for tax benefits, for qualification, for government programs, and that's not been done anywhere else in the world. And so it's really important there to be a neutral playing field in this regard. And I think the pace of that progress will depend on the development of intellectual property in China, which is happening. But it's probably viewed by both the West and China's leaders as too slow.
Okay. Wing, you had a lot of interesting ideas. You urged China to do a lot of radical reforms: financial liberalization, privatizing land, eliminating hukou. What's your expectation? Do you think these reforms are likely to happen? What time frame? And then what happens to the economy if they don't reform?
The privatization process already took place in the urban areas. Because if you look at all the small, medium enterprises, they were either given away to the workers or to the managers who were in charge. And the privatization of housing in China, giving it to the people who were already staying in it. So to the poorest part of the population, that process has yet to come to them. And that, I think, has to do with the fact that if there is land privatization, that would remove the power of the local cadre to reassign land. And also, it will remove an important revenue base for the local governments. So that will require them to undertake fiscal reforms so that the local government does not get its money from land grab and selling the land for industrial projects. And I think it would greatly increase the ability of new migrants to the cities to be able to make the down payment on housing and to start their own or their own workshops if they have some capital from the ownership of rural land. And more importantly, if you want to talk about productivity increases, the fundamental driver is to increase human capital. Increasing human capital means the easiest way to do it is to recognize that the best rural schools are many times worse than the worst urban schools. Urbanization would be a great way to educate many more Chinese children who are neglected in the rural areas because their parents are working in the towns. And furthermore, it is much cheaper to supply good health in urban areas than to send or expand the rural medical system. And we know that any childhood that is characterized by frequent illness in the young days result in an IQ that is 50 points lower. That makes you less able to work and less able to learn. So that, I think, the urbanization process has to be accelerated, but the way in which, but that must be accommodated through the provision of affordable housing. Right now, given the real estate financing mechanisms, these people would never be able to buy real estate. So that requires small, medium private banks, and also require doing what two Chinese societies have done successfully, which is providing affordable housing, Hong Kong and Singapore. That was, they were able to do it because the government owns the land in these places. The only thing you spend the budget on is building the structures. In the US, we cannot do affordable housing because once you pay for the land, you wouldn't have a budget left for the structures. So in the case of China, this is something well within their ability to do, which would enhance human capital accumulation in education and in health, and which is the ultimate drivers of productivity in the long growth. The other great driver of productivity increase is to acquire the existing best technology. But here is where China lags behind, in that many times it wants to invent that technology indigenously. They block Facebook, they block Twitter, and innovations like that. Part of it, of course, is for social political control. Here, this inventing it indigenously, I think, has gone overboard, such that it caters to a lot of rent seeking by the state-linked corporations. I think that China should open up in a lot more in its state procurement policies and in its licensing practices. That, I think, would allow a flow. For example, what is the quickest way to get an inflow of banking technology? The best way to get an inflow of banking technology is to get the best banks in the world to open branches in China, and then at some branch, a Chinese conglomerate hires away all the top managers and start their own banks. That is what a proven formula that works. So China wants Shanghai to become an international financial center, and what do we see? Paralysis. Nothing is happening there because I think they are stuck between advice saying that it is dangerous to open up because you'll be setting yourself up for a financial crisis. That is actually quite misguided. To prevent a financial crisis, you have the adequate prudential regulatory framework in place and so forth. And the other one is to be able to have financial firefighting capacity. What do you do when a crisis breaks out? For example, there's no such thing as permanently open or permanently closed capital accounts. Malaysia has shown that when you need to fight a fire, you close the capital account. And what are the long-run implications? None, regardless of what the IMF said in 1998. Because the outcome was a good one. So this concern, fostered by many well-meaning people, that China has to go slowly because you need to have this already competitive domestic banking system in place, already have a well-functioning prudential system in place. But how do you get these two except through practice? It means that instead of opening everything straight up, you just open it in stages and in increasing degree. That's how you get a financial system that works and regulatory authorities that know how to handle crisis. And part of this is the effort to promote the use of the RMB as an international currency. International currency not in the sense of that it is freely tradable, that is easily available by opening the capital account. In that sense, the Swedish krona is an international currency. Stockholm is an international financial center because anybody could set things up. What China wants for the renminbi is to become of a status, more like that of the US and the euro, and Shanghai to be more like New York and London than Zurich and Geneva or Singapore, right? All of these things are high value added industries. And that is where I think progress can be made. And the amazing thing that you hear is gradualism is the right way to go. I've said that that's not true. The important thing is to focus on financial firefighting capacity. And the other thing is economies of scale as an international currency is very important.
I think we're going to have to cut that off because I want to have time for some questions and answers from the audience. And what I suggest is we take several questions, and then I'll give everybody a chance, and that's probably going to eat up our time. So the young man right there, do we have microphones? You see that? Yes. Just stand up and identify who you are, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Jacob from Elliott School at George Washington University. Thank you for all your sharing. And I have basically two questions. And the first is that at the latest economic conference held by consultation conference held by the Premier Li Keqiang, there are two major economists present saying a pessimistic attitude towards the current Chinese economic situation, and they said maybe we need to adjust the economic structure without stabilizing the economic growth. And all of you mentioned that we should decrease the financial and stimulus in the domestic economic policies. So would you see there could be a possibility for another round of government stimulus in the next few months? And would that be beneficial to the long-term economic structure adjustment? And my second question is about the trade. That would you see a possibility that the U.S. government would lower the limits of the high-tech product export to China in the next few years? Thank you.
Okay, over on this side of the room, anybody? All right, okay. Then I'll definitely hit these two people. I'll start with the man I pointed to in the front.
My name is Xue Jinjun from Nagoya University, Japan. I have a question to the three panelists about TPP. It seems to me that the United States is trying very hard to promote TPP. However, I'm not sure whether United States will convince China to join the TPP. Instead of TPP, in my opinion, that China will, establish a free trade agreement in the Asia-Pacific region. So President Xi Jinping may, at APEC conference, will announce a new proposal to establish that kind of things. So my question is, firstly, do you think the United States will convince China to join the TPP? Secondly, do you think there's some conflict or TPP or free trade agreement in Asia Pacific? So that means that China may take leadership in Asia Pacific free trade agreement, but the United States is now taking the leadership. So do you think that is a conflict or challenge between the two things? Third question is that United States will promote bilateral trade relations with China. That's a good thing, but how it does matter the trade, the TPP and free trade agreement in Pacific Ocean? Three questions. Thank you.
Okay, and then the woman that I pointed to right there.
Hi. My name is Wai-Ping Lu. I'm currently independent strategic consultant because no company and organization hire. I just come back from China. I can see now the Chinese leader in the crisis is to understand the world because they lack personal experience living and studying in the overseas. The current situation even worse than Mao time. In the Mao time, like Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, and Chen Yi, foreign minister, they all have personal experience studying and living overseas. So they have basic sense to understand the world. Even China was, closed door. But now China wide open. The current leader, they don't have personal experience. They really try hard. I believe when I was in China, I mentioned how Japanese conduct intensive research about Western country. One Japanese journalist wrote a book about how French president entertainment stay guests with different courses and wine at state dinner. So the Chinese leader all read that book and taste all the different cuisines and wine, and she show up. I understand this because I believe that he gained weight. But for the political issue between U.S. and China, nobody really truly research or truly understand. Now go between become huge business for these relatives, even his relatives, because he tried to establish the really communication channel by himself, but he feels frustrated now. So my question is whether I'm U.S. citizen, whether U.S. is ready for this situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got, so I'm going to go in reverse order, starting with Wing. Okay, so we have about 3 minutes per person. So why don't you take any of those questions that appeal to you, and I'll clean up. So I'll make sure each question gets addressed, okay?
The question of whether a general stimulus is coming, I think that would certainly be targeted. In other words, like trying to extend credit to hopefully private enterprises and to sectors that are already not characterized by excess capacity. And the housing sector ought to expand, but not in the usual way of providing housing to the upper middle classes for speculative purposes. So there have to be changes in how this stimulus is delivered. The big word should be to drive the economy by unleashing the private sector and increasing productivity through reforms, rather than cheap money, and to start a housing bubble and increase investment. And on the issue of TPP, is it succeeding? Who are the new members that have signed on? As I just said, no progress. The Japanese were our possibly best, most reliable allies in the Pacific, and they have declined to sign on because we have such high quality TPP. And so that's not going anywhere, and we might as well, and I see that in the spirit of big power competition rather than the provision of global public goods. I think there should be a big free trade area that's jointly pushed on both sides of the Pacific. I think if there is one thing I'd like to mention in my last few minutes is the elections that happened yesterday. The question is what's going to happen to Obamacare. I think that if Obamacare is rendered invalid, this will reduce U.S. flexibility in adjusting to changes in the composition of production. Right now, medical care is employer-based. So you don't want any employer to go out of business. And that means protectionism for companies that ought to disappear. And what Obamacare really does is that increases the flexibility of the US government to adjust to people changing jobs and hence not having to worry so much for medical care. So I see protectionism as a likely outcome of yesterday's election if they were to go on to eliminate a whole slew of social protection, which enables the U.S. to respond more flexibly to trade adjustments.
Malcolm, can you answer the question about export controls and anything else? Yeah.
I'll try export controls. So the president and Tom and Mike Froman, have and the secretaries of Commerce have helped, and State have helped, and Defense have helped lead a major liberalization of U.S. export controls. That said, some export controls continue to apply. Some export controls continue to apply specifically to China by law and for national security reasons. As having participated in several years of strategic and economic dialogue and JCCT discussions, this export control liberalization for China is a perennial topic. Just like non-market economy status is a perennial topic. I think that the frustration on the U.S. side, when several specific cases have been raised, is that the information that's needed to make the final determination on a particular item is occasionally not provided. So I think there is potential for some exports to go for which there hasn't been a ruling yet, within the context of the broader liberalization, but it requires effort on both sides.
Okay, thanks.
Just a follow-up on that. I think there's been a misunderstanding in China of export control system, and there's a perception in Beijing that the U.S. export control system is uniquely designed to prevent the exports of technology to China. And in fact, the U.S. has a broad export control program that applies everywhere, and the same system of management and checking and follow-up checking on the disposition of exported goods applies everywhere. And China has traditionally been very reticent about providing that follow-on access to their market after the technology is exported. And that actually tends to prevent some otherwise exportable technologies from reaching their customers in China. That said, given all the other questions about the cyber theft of intellectual property and other things, I think it's very unlikely that you're going to see a wholesale abrogation of national security laws in order to provide more technology to China. On the question of the U.S. Inviting China to join TPP, the U.S. is just one of 12. It is perhaps the U.S. leadership that's driving TPP, but it is one of 12. And I respectfully disagree with Professor Wing that Japan is completely out of the game. I think Japan will ultimately
talking like everybody is.
But I think you're going to see a TPP agreement that is ultimately a first-rate agreement that we can all appreciate and enjoy. I don't know that it's going to become, like the WTO, an agreement onto which third parties that haven't signed on thereafter exceed. That's not really, that hasn't been done with other agreements, so I'm not sure that the TPP is that kind of model. What I do see is the TPP providing a very important intellectual anchor and policy anchor for what you've raised, which is the FTAP. And I see down the road, without the TPP, I doubt very seriously that you have that kind of genuine intellectual basis from which an FTAP can be negotiated. I don't think there is as much conflict between the RCEP and the TPP as some might say. I think they're quite complementary. And while Mr. Donald this morning talked about the development aspects of TPP, it's not really a development agreement. RCEP might be, and the two together might actually joined together might actually provide a very useful broad agreement for Asia. I'm gonna find it very difficult for RCEP to be negotiated as long as India is a driving force at the table. But that's that may be a personal bias. I didn't quite understand the question at the end.
I'm happy to take the leadership. But I also want to weigh in briefly on TPP. You know, there are estimates of the static gains from RCEP and from TPP. And the static gains from RCEP are rather small, because what's being discussed is a rather small amount of trade liberalization. And I agree with Charles that as long as India's in there and you've got a lot of veto powers, it's not much of a trade liberalization. The estimates for TPP are very large, and the relative gains are extremely high for developing countries like Malaysia and Vietnam and the Philippines that are part of the negotiation. So the ambition of TPP is to have really deep integration. And I see this as a very important but risky endeavor, and I link back to what Tom Donilon said. You know, this is a really important part of the U.S. engagement in Asia-Pacific, is trying to create deep integration. And the hope is not that the U.S. would persuade China to join. You know, the hope is first we make TPP succeed among the countries that are involved, and then China will want to join because the benefits of being involved will be extremely large, you know, and the costs of being excluded will be very high. So I think it's important that the U.S. be open and encouraging of China joining, you know, but as Tom Donilon said, it's an issue of meeting the standards. And all of this is a somewhat risky game, you know, because it's possible we'll end up with different regional trading blocks, and that's a very bad world, you know. And what I'm hoping is that aggressively pursuing TPP and the BIT negotiation, you know, will in fact get us eventually to a very open, deeply integrated Asia-Pacific economy. I think we were a little bit confused about the question on leadership, but what resonated with me is in my Treasury job, I got to sit in on a lot of very senior meetings between the U.S. side and the Chinese side. And it always struck me that there was a real lack of understanding on both sides, which I would relate to your point. You know, generally our leaders, you know, tend to be up there in their, you know, late 50s, early 60s, maybe into their 70s. And it's just the way our history has played out on both sides. You know, those are people who never really had an opportunity to go and live in China. You know, you couldn't go and live in China 40 or 50 years ago as an American citizen or as a scholar. And that generation of Chinese leaders you're talking about, they didn't have much experience in the United States. I put a lot of faith now in the young people. We've got 200,000 Chinese students in the U.S. You know, we have a smaller but growing number of American students, you know, studying in China. So I'm hoping we get more understanding, you know, with these coming generations, and that the next 10 years or so is a risky period where we have leaders who don't necessarily understand the other culture very well. If we can get through the risky period, then I think we're going to have, you know, we're going to have a growing number of people on both sides who've got, you know, real deep understanding. We've come to the end of our time. I really want to thank the panelists. Let's give them a nice round of applause.